Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for filling out the Preston Auditorium. And I guess I know why. But the real topic today, and we're going to have a fascinating conversation on the resilience dialogue. In the last few months, unfortunately, we've seen natural disasters with an intensity and a frequency that we have not seen in a long time. But we have been talking about this issue for many years. With climate change, the frequency and the intensity of natural disasters is going to increase. And therefore, we need to get ready not only for the disasters of today, but those of tomorrow. And maybe this is the opening of an understanding of a glimpse on the new window of how things are going to be in the future. Today is the International Day for Disaster Reduction. And therefore, it's the most opportune day to have this resilience dialogue and with this distinguished group and to really figure out in practical ways and have a conversation on how we better protect vulnerable countries and communities from these extreme events. And we will talk a lot about infrastructure today, but it is also not only infrastructure, it is the natural environment, it is the communities, it is the households, the individuals. Resilience is a multidimensional issue altogether. Over the next 20 years, we're going to be building all these countries more infrastructure than in the last 2,000 years. And the way that this infrastructure is built will determine whether it is more resilient or not for generations to come. And therefore, the way in which this infrastructure is built, where is it located, the way that it interrelates with the surrounding environment, with communities, is fundamental. The decisions that local mayors, individuals, the construction industry, the national governments are going to be making in these 2 decades will have a tremendous lock-in effect. So the infrastructure deficit is rising. You look at the numbers and it's always mind-boggling. You never know how many zeros do they have. They say $5 trillion a year into this process. And therefore, the resilience component, the rethinking of how to build this infrastructure is what we want to have today. This is the 13th instance of the Resilience Dialogue series. We had a dozen successful events all over the world, keeping the conversation, keeping and deepening the conversation. And unfortunately, we get a lot more attention right after disasters, and sometimes it goes down. Last year was a year of less disasters, and therefore, I don't think that we filled the room. And this year is very much filled. So we had actually a meeting yesterday with governments from the Caribbean discussing progress on the Caribbean Resilience Insurance Facility. And you would have seen it was a standing room only. And we had prime ministers sitting there and saying, how do we get together for that? So thank you for coming. Thank you to the partners of the Resilience Dialogue, the government of Japan, GFDRR, the European Union, USAID. Thank you to the climate group at the World Bank. John Room, our Senior Director for Climate, must be in the room. Thank you to him and his team for organizing this process. And I want to invite all of you to send your questions as we had the dialogue to the hashtag Resilience Dialogue. We're not going to have open mics. I'm going to have my phone open. So send the questions, because then I'm going to start grouping and bringing into the conversation. Hashtag Resilience Dialogue all together. So with that, let me invite Koichi Hasegawa, the Senior Vice President for the Japan International Cooperation JICA agency, to welcome us and to say a few words here on stage. Hasegawa-san.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Today we are here to discuss the role of how quality infrastructure improves resilience against climate and disaster risks. The timing could not be more relevant. Even within these past few months, the world has witnessed enormously destructive natural disasters, including various hurricanes and earthquakes. Given this, I would like to express my deepest condolences to the countries and people who are affected by those disasters. As you are all aware, disasters are growing in magnitude. The previous World Bank report warns that without significant investment to make cities more resilient, the cost of natural disasters in cities worldwide will increase from $250 billion today to $314 billion in 2030. This means that an additional 77 million urban residents may be pushed into poverty because of the impacts of climate change. Thankfully, efforts to combat this are already in progress. Momentum to fight these global issues have grown in the past decade, including through the establishment of SDGs and Paris Agreement, and also the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. Today, I would like to encourage us to make the best use of this momentum to improve disaster resilience by discussing two main points about resilient infrastructure. First, what does it mean to have quality infrastructure? And second, how do we build resilience? The importance of this term, quality infrastructure, was highlighted both when the G7 leaders met at the Ise-Shima Summit in May last year and during the UN Habitat 3 last October. While this term is getting popular, it is important to understand what exactly we are talking about. I would like to demonstrate this concept by sharing a good example of good quality infrastructure in Antigua and Barbuda in light of the unfortunate devastation caused by Hurricane Irma. In Antigua and Barbuda, Hurricane Irma severely destroyed 95% of buildings. However, in the midst of the devastation, there was a wharf and a slipway that survived, which played a significant role in evacuating residents and transporting food and supplies to the country in the hurricane's aftermath. This is largely due to the quality of the infrastructure financed by JICA back in 2011. Quality infrastructure therefore encompasses a concept that the infrastructure is stable, reliable, sustainable, long-lasting, inclusive, and has low maintenance costs. Overall, it should be a positive economic investment. My second point is about how we go about building resilience. As you are all aware, the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction was agreed to in March 2015. In short, the framework made it clear that resilience cannot be separated from risk reduction, and both are necessary to ensure sustainable development. In many developing countries that face budget limitations, short-term economic gains are often prioritized over disaster risk reduction, and the amount that is allocated to it is disproportionately spent on emergency relief rather than on prevention and mitigation. This is the case even when we know disaster damage and destroy the very outcomes that were made by previous development investments. Since natural disasters frequently strike the same areas, lives are continuously lost, and survivors are repeatedly deprived of economic growth opportunities, causing a vicious cycle of poverty. So how can we overcome these issues? Technologies and information access are indispensable to bring new perspectives and provide breakthroughs on issues that have been unresolved through conventional means. The government of Japan has partnered with GFDRR in the disaster risk reduction sector to prepare new knowledge tools that can be leveraged for innovative solutions and provide technical assistance to partner countries. JICA has also played a significant role in introducing Japan's experiences and knowledge to propel these endeavors, and we believe they can be tailored to fit the needs of countries that have been affected by disasters. Today, I hope that this discussion will build on our past experiences and generate new ideas to stop the vicious cycle of poverty by building resilient societies. Thank you very much.
Hasegawa-san, thank you very much. Look, Japan is a country not only that I think is one that has worked for decades on resilience and has achieved a level of expertise that is unique in the world, but one that has generously shared with countries around the world. But even then, I'm always amazed when I sit down and talk to Japanese officials on the continuous process of improving. It's not that you become resilient, we're done. I was visiting some of the areas affected after the Great Tsunami, and actually they were saying that the proportion of children who died was much lower than the rest of the population because they knew what to do. They exactly were ready, they had done the drills, they knew what the process altogether. So I think that it is a continuous process of exchange. They were very worried, for example, of people with disabilities who actually had died in a higher proportion, not because they didn't have universal access in the infrastructure, but because they needed the community preparedness to know who will be the person who will be taking care of the people with disability and who will be the backup in case of a disaster. So continuous lessons of improvement, and I think that that's something that we take back from Japan. And now, somebody to inspire us, somebody to really bring a new level of energy, which is what we need for resilience in everything that we do. It's my great pleasure and honor on behalf of the World Bank Group to welcome Sir Richard Branson, head of the Virgin Group, to help us think through how do we raise the game on resilience. Thank you so much.
Dear friends, I'm incredibly grateful to be with you all today. And I'd like to thank, and this is quite a mouthful, the Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery and the UN Office for Disaster Risk and Reduction for inviting me. Your mission, everybody's mission in this room is enormously important, but you would probably agree that it shouldn't take disasters of the scale we've just seen for people to appreciate the true value of your wonderful work. I've spent much of my time in the last few weeks dealing with the devastating impacts of Hurricanes Irma and Maria, and it had a devastating effect on the beautiful Caribbean, and trying to find ways in which we can rebuild all that's been lost and help the affected communities get back on their feet. As our Caribbean corner of the world is subjected to nature's fury, I can't help but ask how much more destruction is needed to show that the way we treat our planet is having serious consequences, and sadly will have even more serious consequences. Scientists have highlighted the link between carbon emissions and ocean surface temperatures. When Irma struck, the Atlantic and Caribbean waters had reached temperatures of 86 degrees Fahrenheit, 30 degrees Celsius in some places. And I don't believe we need any further proof than that to know the time to act is now, both globally and locally. As some of you will know, I decided to ride out Hurricane Irma in my home in the British Virgin Islands. And to be perfectly honest, none of us hunkering down in the basement we were on Necker Island were prepared for its force and for its intensity. Irma unleashed the most ferocious winds I've ever seen in my life, and I've been through three hurricanes before that. And it was truly heartbreaking to see the full extent of the devastation across the entire community once the storm had passed. Obviously, Japan has seen the effects of a nuclear bomb, and you can never compare anything quite to that, but it really, to me, felt like that when I looked outside. In the BVI, I think every single island has been hit really hard and battered, and I think more than 80% of all residential buildings have become uninhabitable. All the local infrastructure, power, telecommunications, water, sanitation has either been destroyed or seriously damaged. While the last month or so has been devastating for everybody in the BVIs, I've been living in the Caribbean for a long time and know its amazing people well. Their resilience, their spirit are an incredible inspiration. The tasks ahead of them are daunting, but it's the people who give me hope that the Caribbean islands will bounce back stronger than ever. Let me be clear, from Puerto Rico to the BVI and Dominica, this is still very much a relief operation. Tens of thousands continue to be without shelter, power, and access to clean and safe drinking water. These urgent needs must be met, and they must be met quickly. This year's hurricane season is not yet over, and another storm could strike in the coming weeks. In parallel, we have to start thinking beyond emergency relief and turn our attention to the island's long-term recovery and reconstruction. Resilience is the theme of today's event, and resilience was the topic of many conversations I've had in the last few weeks. It really comes down to this question: as hurricanes will hit more often and with growing intensity, how can Caribbean islands avoid total destruction becoming the norm? Among other things, this means building homes able to withstand sustained and catastrophic hurricane-force winds over longer periods of time. It means installing distributed power grids that don't break down and that can be easily and can be repaired quickly. And it means restoring critical ecosystems like mangrove wetlands and even coral reefs that mitigate direct impacts of storms by naturally reducing wave heights and preventing soil erosion. And perhaps most importantly, it means weaning Caribbean islands off their costly dependency on fossil fuels. Running much of the region on diesel and other fuels comes with an enormous price tag. The Caribbean's cost of electricity generation is among the world's highest, and fuel expenditures consume up to 25% of GDP in most Caribbean nations. As an investor and as an entrepreneur, I've never seen a more compelling business case than the one presented by more energy-efficient systems that make use of the abundance of the region's natural resources, like solar and wind. Remember, you don't have to ship in sunshine on expensive boats. And while we're talking about resilience, I was heartened by the story of a Puerto Rican flower grower, Hector Santiago, whose solar panels sustained only minor damage during Hurricane Maria, and that allowed him to keep his plant nursery running, even as the rest of the island completely lost power. Well, that's the type of resilience I imagine would like to see go to scale. And by the way, solar panels saved us too on Necker Island. Unlike the rest of the BVI, just to illustrate a point, we had our electricity back in 24 hours, whereas Tortola, they're talking about potentially 9 months. So, it was just wonderful seeing amongst all this devastation, the solar panels having survived. Aside from the vastly improving resilience through better systems, diversified energy supplies will also have a really positive economic effect. A few years ago, Jamaica quickly moved up 27 positions on the World Bank's Global Doing Business ranking, and I think that was quite largely as a result of reducing electricity costs through their clean energy movements. In sum, for the type of reconstruction we all envision, the Caribbean must seize the opportunity and take the leap from 20th century technology to 21st century innovation. This includes resisting the impulse to return to business as usual when it comes to reconstruction, simply because it is easier and cheaper in the short term. You can frame this as a formidable political and economic challenge, but I think we can be far more optimistic than that. With the political will and with the strong leadership emerging now across the region, and bolstered by strong support from the international community and businesses willing to invest, these island states have a great opportunity to build greener and more resilient communities than ever before, setting shining examples of what climate-smart recovery around the world can and should look like. Needless to say, an ounce spent on resilience now will be a pound saved in dealing with tomorrow's disasters. To find leadership in this space, you don't have to look much further than what has already been done in the Caribbean. A few years ago, Aruba announced an ambitious strategy to run entirely on renewables by 2020, and the island is already halfway there. And in Barbados, 1 in 2 households are now using solar water heaters, not only reducing electricity costs, but also creating jobs in a budding solar industry. And these are fantastic examples. What we need now is scale. And I suspect this hurricane might have just given us that opportunity. I have on various occasions called for a Marshall Plan for the Caribbean, a comprehensive strategy led by Caribbean governments to shape their own future and rebuild their nations. And from this meeting, I'm going to meet with the heads of Caribbean nations to try to put that in place. I think the consensus is that it's got to be a Marshall Plan for a greener, resilient Caribbean. The time now is to make this happen. And I just want to say thank you all for being here, for the incredibly important work that you all do to ensure that humankind is not left defenseless in the face of disasters like this. Thank you very much. Cheers.
I think we have a clear call for action for a greener and more resilient reconstruction, a greener and more resilient Caribbean. And actually, this is just an example of what we see countries facing around the world when they're trying to define their reconstruction strategies. And this is precisely what we want to talk with one of the best panels that I have seen in many years in the World Bank on a combination of perspectives and experience altogether. So we're going to have a transition video so that the panel members can come to a stage and also to discuss a little bit of this question: can resilient infrastructure help save the world? Before we move to that, a quick reminder, your questions to #ResilienceDialogue. I'm going to be monitoring them into this process. We want to discuss what is the role of quality infrastructure in building, as Sir Branson said, a greener, more resilient world, how to take an in-depth look at how to scale up resilient infrastructure investment in vulnerable countries like the Caribbean, where the economic progress is 2 steps forward, 1 step backward, and where the levels of debt has grown tremendously because of the burden of reconstruction, and really how to look at the potential of innovative solutions, both on the green infrastructure side and on the financing side, to really try to tackle reconstruction efforts in a way that is better than ever before. Resilience Dialogue, # for your questions, and let me invite the panel to join us while the video is played. Thank you.
Cities around the world are growing at unprecedented rates. Up to 1.4 million people per week are moving into urban areas. As much as 90% of this growth is happening in Africa and Asia, where tremendous investments in infrastructure are needed to support these expanding populations. In fact, more infrastructure will be built over the next 20 years than humanity has built in the last 2,000. This furious pace of development will either lock in risk or resilience for cities that are increasingly vulnerable to climate change and natural disasters. The trend so far is concerning. Impacts from disasters have risen sharply over the last few decades, and losses in the built environment alone will likely surpass $400 billion per year by 2030. This means more communities cut off from transportation networks, vital services, recovery efforts, and commerce, which could roll back decades of development gains. The built environment is the first line of defense against the impact of disasters. Resilient infrastructure saves lives and helps preserve livelihoods. Take the case of Japan. For decades, the government of Japan has proactively invested in quality infrastructure, leading the world in disaster risk management. A culture of risk prevention, developed through decades of government efforts, permeates the islands. Japan boasts the largest flood prevention infrastructure in the world, while its massive skyscrapers contain cutting-edge technology to reduce seismic risk. Development partners are working to scale up the quality infrastructure agenda within vulnerable countries, but demand for these projects is soaring. Recent estimates put global infrastructure needs at more than $5 trillion per year. Increasingly, experts are turning to nature to help. Called green infrastructure, nature-based solutions offer an effective, low-cost way to boost resilience while benefiting communities and protecting ecosystems. In some areas, however, like small island states, climate change and natural disasters pose an existential threat. A record-breaking hurricane season recently brought this reality crashing into the shores of the Caribbean, with dozens of lives lost. Can resilient infrastructure prevent disasters like these? How can man-made and nature-based solutions work together to protect the world's growing urban populations? And how do we bring these projects to scale in vulnerable countries? Over the next hour, we'll explore these questions and more. Together, we can build a safer and more resilient future.
Wonderful. Thank you very much to GFDRR for setting the stage with this video. And now we get to a conversation. It's going to be a very open conversation. And I think that we have one of the best, as I was saying, one of the best panels that we had in a long, long time, the World Bank. Let me do quick introductions before we jump into the conversation. Haris Papadopoulos was the former CEO of Titan America, but somebody who has been obsessed about years about resilience. His book, Resilience, The Ultimate Sustainability, if you haven't read it, highly recommended. Looking at a lot of what is happening in the US, how the US got to what it is, and the weaknesses on resilience, and why the market forces and the society forces have gotten to the point that we are. He was also the head of the working group for UNISDR from the private sector to help us think through resilience, and he will help us bring that private core and why the private sector is an indispensable partner into this process. Cristiana Figueres needs no introduction, one of our climate champions in the World Bank, and if I may say, we had the Paris deal thanks to you. So it's always a great pressure to the undeniable force, patience, dedication to make sure that it happened. So thank you for joining us. And now she's also the Mission 2020 convener, a global initiative to try to look, we really need to go down in the curve of emissions, making sure that we really take action and in this very short period of time to change the direction in which the world is going in a faster way. We have made some progress, but part of Cristiana's message is that it's not enough. We need to deepen the engagement altogether. And a great pleasure to have with us Kamal Kishore, member of the National Disaster Management Authority of India, somebody who has worked on resilience at the local, at the regional, the national level for decades, a great partner of the World Bank, somebody who the actions with him and his team has shown that it is possible to get resilient, and it is not only a 20-year perspective, you can be more resilient in a couple of years with practical actions, decisive community engagement, and the construction of more resilient infrastructure. So with that, let's get on with the conversation. So Haris, I finished reading your book again, and there are always fascinating quotes on why do we close our eyes to disasters and we hope for the best. But give us a few thoughts from your private sector experience on why we really need to change the direction. This is the way that we're going on infrastructure and the way that the private sector needs to raise the voice and improve resilience is critical for where we go.
First of all, thank you. I'm very honored to be part of this panel and look forward to a challenging dialogue. I think we all want the same things, but approach them from our different perspectives. And we have to recognize first that we have a problem. And we have to also admit that we are both part of the problem and part of the solution, and move in that direction. Now, I spent my career, 25 years in the construction industry, and I saw a lot of the problems happening. But also through my life, I experienced disasters, and I realized that part of my purpose is to see how we can avoid them. Now, the construction industry and the property industry in general is the biggest wealth-creating activity in the world. Mm-hmm. We have to recognize that. There's a lot of money. And as a businessman, I always like to say, if you want to understand why things happen, follow the money. And you can see why people do what they do. Now, this industry is enormous. It's much more difficult to put your arms around or regulate compared to the power industry or the car industry or even the health industry. Somebody compared it to a vast army of fire ants. From the small builder who's building the favelas or slums in some of the big developing cities to the major international construction companies and everything in between. But the system, we have a system problem. And today, unfortunately, we're building vulnerable buildings and infrastructure at a faster rate than we are building resilient ones. Because you can make money doing it. And until we change that, it's going to be very difficult to change everything. Now, the focus today, I know, is on infrastructure. And I'd like to frame the topic there that there's two different categories of infrastructure. There's the infrastructure that provides basic services, kind of utilities, and also logistics, transportation services, some of which in some countries is privatized or semi-privatized. And then there's the infrastructure to defend us against hazards. Okay. Now, from insurance information, 4 hazards account for almost 85% of the disasters: wind, water, fire, and seismic. Of those 4, only 1 we can address with infrastructure, water. The other 3 rather, wind, seismic, and fire, we have to address with resilient buildings, totally. And the history of water defense infrastructure has been mixed so far. I'm a skeptic of anything we build, being an engineer and builder myself, because first of all, it has its limits, and second of all, you've got to maintain it. And if you don't maintain it, it will lose its effectiveness and upgrade it from time to time. So I kind of want to frame the topic initially in that and look forward to the insights from others. Yeah.
Follow the money. Building infrastructure is an integral part of that process. We cannot think that resilience is only the government function to protect with dikes and infrastructure the process. The buildings, and remember, most of the housing and the buildings in developing countries is yet to be built. And therefore, the way that it's built defines whether it is low carbon and resilient or not into this process. So, Cristiana, you are a deal maker. Okay, so we got where we are thanks to your incredible ability. But a lot of the discussion was very much on the mitigation side, okay? And there wasn't as much on the resilience side into this process. How do we get a better global deal on resilience? How do we raise the game into this process? How do we get coalitions that look into this process and that, in a way, marry mitigation and resilience as not separate sides of the coin, but part and parcel of sustainability? Thoughts on that?
Well, thank you. And thank you for the invitation to join the 2 wonderful gentlemen here. It is true that from the climate perspective, what we call that is adaptation. And it is sadly true that adaptation was and continues to be lagging behind in agreements, in negotiation, in understanding. And I think that is the reason why it has not caught up, because we're still trying to put our hands around it. We're still trying to understand, of your 4, there are 3 that are actually made worse by climate change. The only one that is not affected or maximized by climate is seismic. But all other 3, wind, fire, and water, are definitely multiplied by climate change. And it's very difficult, A, to understand that, and how much would be quote unquote natural and how much is additional because of climate change. Plus, the fact that we still have runaway emissions means that we are going to be having more and more and more destruction. And so the quantification of that is very difficult to do. And hence, because all of that is still unanswered, I think that is the reason why we have such a hard time. Having said all of that, resilient infrastructure, moving away from negotiations to the real life, because there is the negotiation life and there's the real life. And moving into the real life, there is no doubt that resilient infrastructure is absolutely urgent, I would say, for 3 reasons. The human, the economic, and the systemic. So the human is because we understand that although we have different types of infrastructure, that the fact is that they're all, from a human perspective, they're all interrelated. And the failing of one leads to the failing of others. And ultimately, it leads to the loss of life in the worst case, or at least to the loss of well-being, livelihood, homes, etc. So the lack of resilience in infrastructure has a huge human cost that needs to be front and center. Secondly, there is an economic argument here because we know that climate change is going to make these disasters perhaps not more frequent, but certainly much more intensive. And that means that we're going to be, particularly in developing countries, into a constant reconstruct mode if we do not build resilience into our infrastructure. So the expense of the constant construct, reconstruct is one that, frankly, no country can afford. So you have a human compelling case, you have an economic compelling case, and you have a systemic case that we don't usually talk about. And that is because we know that we are going to be getting more of these effects, we cannot let ourselves get to a scenario in which we are systemically uninsurable. If we, and you know, of the disasters that struck us over the past few months, not more than 1/2 was covered by insurance today. And that means every time that we have one of these, the insurance companies are going to be more and more reticent about covering that because the costs are going to be higher and premiums are not completely elastic. So we cannot, in investing into the resilience of infrastructure is both for the human and for the economic, and above all, to keep ourselves within the scenario of being able to have insurance systems that will be able to cover this. So for all three reasons, absolutely urgent.
Absolutely, and I want to connect the two of you later on because the linkage between the insurance industry and the construction industry begins to be very important in the sense that to close the loop, the only way to become uninsured, to avoid that situation of systemic uninsurable, is to have buildings that are more resilient so that the damages come. And therefore, how do you close the loop? How do you get the buyers of the buildings to understand what kind of resilience are they buying? The industry to start saying, if you don't build this way, sorry, we don't insure you. And to close the loop into it. We haven't had that set of conversation at a practical level enough at a scale to move into that direction. So hints on the next question coming up. Okay, Kamal, India. India has shown that actually with the cyclones, you can take action and you can become more resilient in a short period of time. I see many countries around the world when we discuss that they see climate change and resilience as, we'll get there in 20 years. Right now we have so many urgent things to tackle that this becomes lower in the priority. Why did it become so important? What did you do in practical terms to deal with cyclones?
Well, I think first, why did it become important? Because it affects a huge number of people. We have a long coastline, very high exposure to cyclones. The success we've had in reducing mortality from cyclones is much celebrated. In a span of 10 years, less than 2%, comparable events of 1999, 2003. And to my mind, the basic ingredients which actually led to this success are three. And I'll try to capture them in simple words. The first is community, and I think that's in that order. The second is an application-oriented work on science, and the third is resilient infrastructure. If you don't have any of these three, you cannot achieve the results, loss reduction results that you want to achieve. On the community one, the biggest resource we have, and Sir Richard Branson's speech talked about the context in Caribbean, is the affected people themselves. Their initiative, their knowledge, their resources are the starting point. They are not the bottom end. They are the top end of the spectrum. So whatever work we did on cyclones, whether it was building multipurpose cyclone shelters, connecting roads, early warning systems, community was at the center of it. They are not a subject of our intervention. They are the drivers of the intervention. The second is application-oriented science. So the progress we've made in providing good forecasts, early warning, actionable, I think it has more than paid for itself. The investment we made in science, which is really application-oriented. So on a coastline, if you reduce the sort of window of uncertainty for landfall by 20%, the number of people you need to evacuate goes down dramatically, and hence it saves cost, it's much easier as well. So application-oriented science, which really brings science to society, to people. The third is resilient infrastructure. You can have cyclone shelters. You can have early warning systems. But if there isn't resilient infrastructure that people can use to get from where they live to the shelter, it's not going to work. And the notion of resilient infrastructure needs to be extended to include other utilities as well. How do you lay your electricity lines so that it is resilient to cyclones? How do you do telecom networks? So a comprehensive work on all of these three through our National Cyclone Risk Mitigation Program led to this reduction in mortality. But I must say that while we take satisfaction in it, we can't be complacent with this. We have to keep at it. We've done a good job of saving lives. We have to do a much better job of saving livelihoods. Mm-hmm. And that really requires working across multiple infrastructure sectors.
Yes.
And the kind of investment we are going to look at in India is just enormous. We are looking at $120 billion every year. Our power sector, the energy production, electricity production in 10 years is going to double. We will have roads, road network, highways, 1.5 times of what we have now in 10 years, which means 10,000 kilometers of new roads. The metro networks, many cities are building metros. It will be 6 times of what it is right now in a very short period of time. Same is the story in aviation. The same is the story in shipping. Now, if you build 10,000 kilometers of roads, not only does it have to be resilient itself, you also have to look at, that it doesn't create risk for the others. Not just risk to infrastructure, but also risk from infrastructure. It will change the landscape. So it's a very complex thing, and this is something we would like to work with other countries as well to see how do we address this? How do we address uncertainties associated with future risks as well?
And I think that the word uncertainty becomes really important into this process because not only is it difficult to think through and bring the science to understand the change of resilience by building infrastructure, but once the models to understand downscaling of climate change impact becomes complicated into this process or that process. But I take 2 points. Community at the center of resilient infrastructure, and it's important to start moving from saving lives to saving livelihoods into this process. Now, Haris, back to the question and the hint. What are the incentives that are needed when you were in the construction industry to make sure that the next generation of buildings are more resilient? Is it just the insurance industry? Is it more knowledge by the consumers of the risk? What is it? I mean, when you were building and selling construction materials and cement, what did you say? I'm not doing it because I don't get the pressure from A, B, and C.
There's 2 dimensions, let's say, to resilience or vulnerability. One is where we build, and the second is how we build. Okay, and that applies both to housing, commercial, but also to infrastructure, for example. And where we build is half of the battle. In other words, if we build in the wrong places, meaning vulnerable locations, we have to do 3-4 more times the effort to make it resilient. The problem is we don't do that. In other words, we built in the vulnerable locations to the same standards almost that we would build in the safer locations. And what's the result? We have disaster. The problem today in most urbanization is land. Most cities initially occupied the safer part of that location, the hills. Most of the ancient cities were built on hills. And then as we grew, we ran out of the high ground. And what do? We fill in the swamps, we fill in the creeks, we fill in everything, we built everything. We even extended the coast, and we built there. Okay. All that increased our vulnerability. The problem with land is that, our whole concept of development is based on concentration of population. And that's a bigger problem than we can solve today here. But, I saw the example, for example, in Mexico, 6-7 years ago, they embarked on a big housing project. They created entire villages away from Mexico City. The problem is they didn't think of all the infrastructure that is needed to bring jobs there, to bring the people into the center and back, to create a real community. And most of those developments are mostly unoccupied. So picking the right locations and then investing infrastructure in those locations. I would recommend to the World Bank and any government agency, do not put infrastructure in bad locations. You're actually doing more harm than good. Building a good bridge to a barrier, flood-prone island and encouraging development there is going to create risk and is a future disaster. So that is one thing that has to stop. So part of the role of government is planning the land, making good land available. Now there, I've been in discussions with environmental groups. They say, okay, you can't build here because it's a floodplain. You can't build there, there's a forest. You can't build there because there's some kind of an animal that needs to be protected. Where am I going to build, I ask. They don't have an answer. I mean, we have to make those choices as society and say, we're going to build there because it meets those criteria and enable the economics of that construction to happen. Because when that doesn't happen, then you have development by default. And we see that in all the major cities.
But vice versa, in the sense that not considering the green dimensions, for example, and what we see in many places of the eradication of wetlands for construction, they may be the right location, but as Kishore was saying, as Kamal was saying, it's like then you are exacerbating the flooding problem and therefore reducing the resilience altogether. So how do you balance that process? I mean, what's the right location?
Well,
you don't have to answer now.
I think our ancestors already knew the answer thousands of years ago. The high ground, the firma terra, as the Romans would say it. That's the best defense.
Wonderful.
Can
yes.
I follow in on that? Because I kind of have a feeling that for many years we've been jumping to step number 3. I think of resilience infrastructure in 3 steps. Map it, price it, then build it. And unfortunately, we've been going the other way around. We've just been building wherever, and hence the cost that we're seeing. So map it is my way of summarizing what you have just very eloquently said, much more eloquently than I, is to map out where the high-risk areas are, or where the high-risk infrastructure, and really be very, very sure that we're not compounding the risk of that naturally occurring place by putting infrastructure on it. So that's number 1. The second piece that we, consistently do not do after, even if we mapped it, the second piece is price it. Because we have not made visible the price of vulnerable infrastructure. We haven't given that a cost. And it's embedded in that infrastructure, but we haven't picked it up and said, okay, let us understand, A, the cost of the vulnerable infrastructure, B, let us understand what the additional investment would be to make it resilient, probably from the literature that we know, not more than 10% more in construction costs, and totally recuperable in operating costs, in fact, even including low carbon and high resilience, both together. So map it definitely, but then we also have to price it properly to understand where is the real cost and where is the long-term profitability of that. And then you go to number 3, which is build it, and build it obviously with those low carbon and high resilience. Because the other piece here that I need to put in here, although we're talking about resilience, is it does us absolutely no good in the big scheme to build infrastructure that is resilient to impacts if that infrastructure is contributing to the problem in the beginning, the problem of higher emissions. So the infrastructure that we build, and 60% of the infrastructure that we're going to need, is still not built. Huge opportunity to be infrastructure that is both high resilience and low carbon, because otherwise we are contributing to the origin of the problem.
And I don't think also that we are not valuing enough the green infrastructure, if we were to call it, the resilience value of the wetlands and the mangroves in the whole equation. So you combine the two, and then you start making the bad choices also on the resilient infrastructure protect into this process. And it becomes actually an interesting discussion of the role of nature into this equation. So the Public Works Commission of New York was saying, look, we wanted to use the parks as flooding process because you knew that it's going to happen frequently enough. But then it becomes a a discussion of do you protect also the parks for this process or not? What is the value into this direction? So much to be done into this process. Before I pass on to Kamal, a reminder, because I'm not seeing enough questions, hashtag resilience dialogue. We want to have this and it's an interactive, your opportunities to open up.
Should we send our own questions?
You can also send your own questions. Now, Kamal, how do you tell us a little bit of the kind of discussions that you have with the Secretary of Powers or the Chief Minister of States when you try to convince, look, yes, it may be a little bit more expensive to build resilient infrastructure, but it's the right thing to do. How do you convince them?
I think, let me come to that question but before I do that, let me reflect a little bit on what was said about the whole issue of land use planning, location of infrastructure and capital assets in hazard-prone areas. I think in some contexts, the choices are very limited, and trade-offs have to be made. I just want to sort of give you examples from recent floods. In just one state in India, in the floods, 17 million people were affected. That's more than the population of 121 countries in the world. So that means in 2/3 of the countries of the world, if a similar flood had happened, the whole country would be affected, and about 1/10 at least would have to be displaced. So in such a context, what are we talking? Where do we relocate? The scale is completely, mind-numbing. It's just how do you deal with that? And in dealing with that, we have to sort of also not underestimate the trade-offs that people make and the community intelligence in this whole scheme. You mentioned the hazards, the wind and the water, but these are not just hazards, they're also resources. In a good year, they are a resource. In a bad year, they're a hazard. And over hundreds of years, communities have evolved a mechanism by which the resource side of things outweighs the hazard side. But as we know, as everybody is saying, the future is not going to be like the past. But what is the threshold? What is the threshold at which we begin to say that it's no longer workable? The hazard side is outweighing the resource side. And who does that analytics? How do we assign values to uncertainties? And once we know that we have reached a threshold, what do we do about it? At a scale which is meaningful. I think the time for boutique interventions is over. If we can't do things at a scale,
no more pilot projects.
No more pilot projects. If we can't come up with solutions which are affordable, sustainable, and scalable, you are wasting our time. So I think it is important to say that the notion of diversification, the notion of relocation, all of these are good concepts, very difficult to implement on the ground. Extremely difficult to implement on the ground, especially for people who are living a subsistence economy. Their carbon footprint is negligible. So we can't tell them that move there, build greener. It's not possible. So now coming back to your question, whether when one approaches an investor or a government department, whether how do we sort of make infrastructure resilient? I think the acceptance is there, because if you do a good cost-benefit analysis for infrastructure and look at it not at the upfront cost, the case has to be made over a life cycle.
Exactly.
Because it's not just the damage to infrastructure, it's also its disrupted operation and the flow impacts that it creates if you don't build it in a proper way. So if you do that analysis and not just look at the capital, but also look at the operation, maintenance, the economic impact. If you have a bridge, crossing the river Ganges and you stop it for a day or you stop half of it for a day, the economic impact is huge. So we really have to make this case of life cycle, cost and benefit, not just the upfront cost with the infrastructure. Once you make that argument, the case is made, and I don't think we have to make the case. I think the issue of what needs to be done is more or less clear. but how it is to be done. How do you do risk analytics at a scale to address the policymakers' questions? How do you build standards? How do you regulate professions that are involved in construction of infrastructure? How do you incentivize financing of infrastructure so that it nudges, that's the flavor now, people in the direction of resilience? How do you have predictable mechanisms for recovery of infrastructure, not just from big disasters? You talked about reconstruction after big disasters, but what about small disasters which progressively degrade infrastructure and make people vulnerable? So you are going in that downward spiral. How do you have predictable mechanisms to support recovery infrastructure, not just in big ones, but also in small, medium-scale disasters? So I think the conversation we need to have now is, how do we do it? How is more difficult than the what? On the what, case is settled.
Can I ask them a question on nudging? Because I would be very interested in here. You may know that Mark Carney, the governor of the Bank of England, under the Financial Stability Board, has started something called the Task Force for Financial Disclosure of Climate Risk. And usually, people who work on mitigation understand that what is being requested there is a disclosure of the exposure to high carbon assets. The fact is that if you look carefully at what is being requested there, it's not just the exposure to high carbon assets, it's actually the exposure to risk, to both chronic risks as well as acute risks. So physical disasters as well as long-term risks. And I would be very interested in knowing, do you think, currently that disclosure is only voluntary, it is beginning to be adopted by some corporations, but do you think that that disclosure of risk, of the risk of destruction of the infrastructure, if that disclosure were made mandatory, do you think that that would nudge capital in the right direction? Because what it would do is it would actually give a value, right, to the life cycle costs. It would pull that value into the present, and then you could make, from an investor point of view, a better decision. Is that one way of doing that?
And to complement, actually, is disclosure to the household to understand the risk that they're doing into this process, which is what you guys were doing in your job, in your book. So, reactions?
No, I think excellent discussion, by the way. I mean, the comments on pricing, the magnitude of the problem that we have, and now this topic of disclosure. For me, the disclosure falls under a bigger umbrella, which I call transparency. And the property, let's say, sector is much more consumer-driven, let's say, than it is business-driven. So, yes, business disclosure, I think, will progress, in the right direction when it happens. But I think one of the basic problems we face is that governments themselves are not willing to be transparent with their own people. Okay, and I see that in many countries. They're not willing to tell their people, you are at serious risk here, or this house has flooded X times in the past. I mean, we could not get FEMA in the US to disclose the flood history. Not, how much the property owner got in money, but just that the certain property had flooded 5 times. And there's a problem there because property is a big source of revenue for many governments. Mm-hmm. The tax on property is a big income source. Mm-hmm. And so there's almost a collusive relationship there that we've got to keep this thing under control. We can't rock the boat that provides us with a lot of local revenue, because if we do so, we're going to disrupt, we're not going to be able to pay the schools, the police, the this, the that, And it's driven us down the wrong path, this kind of, indirect. So to me, transparency is a big topic, and we need more of it. I think it's coming. I believe that information technology, the existence of smartphones that we have today, I believe not too far in the future, we will be able to see house X is riskier than house Y, or location X is riskier than location Y, bypassing a lot of, the official, let's say, processes, because if you try to look at do research, and I do a lot of research, I mean, it takes a lot of time to find out what the risks are of a particular neighborhood or even a particular house. So I put a bigger umbrella on transparency.
And I guess linked to a question from the audience on liability, how does this comes into the whole process of liability for exacerbating risks by different agencies or by builders into all this process? Good question to reflect. So you had a question from Christiana. Thoughts on? Sorry. There a question on disclosure nudging.
Yeah, okay. So on the issue of disclosure and nudging, yes, I think that would be desirable if infrastructure developers disclose the kind of risk they have. But at the same time, I wonder whether the whole notion of putting risk information out there is something that we can leave to the market to do. I think this is something which is really in the public sector domain, to make good hazard information, exposure information, vulnerability information available out there in the public domain. And they may not, I mean, there are sensitivities. But
they don't have an interest in doing so.
There are sensitivities when you come to sort of a very sort of fine resolution, this houses versus that house. But, I mean, we made the earthquake maps very high resolution, available to the public just a few months ago. We are doing similar work for floods and similar work for other hazards. But it takes time. And also, which are the agencies of the government which will actually bring about integration across different kinds of hazard information? Right now, a lot of hazard information is produced in silos. The analytics to bring it all together, combine it with multiple hazards, vulnerability exposure, and come up with good analytical frame which informs people that this is what you have, this is what you're dealing with. This is something really falls, squarely within the domain of what governments should be doing.
Christian, I'd love to ask you, because I've heard your answer, and I think this audience, to the following question, I think this audience will love it, that
Tell me what you're going to
No, I'm going to ask you a question because I have heard your answer, and this audience is going to love it.
Okay, I hope I remember.
This dichotomy between mitigation and adaptation, and different camps arguing and saying, if we focus on adaptation, then we're going to lose attention and action on mitigation. And you've heard this argument before.
Yeah.
What would you say to that, particularly on the Mission 2020, and what is the linkage to resilience, the urgency?
I frankly have absolutely zero tolerance for that argument, okay? Zero tolerance, because we have to understand that those two things are like taking one piece of paper and saying either you choose this or you choose this. There are two sides of the paper, and there are two sides to the reality of climate change. And I continue to say the most effective and urgent measure of adaptation is immediate mitigation. It doesn't mean mitigation over the next 20 to 30 to 40 years. Frankly, that's not going to help. It's immediate mitigation right now. Because if we do not do immediate mitigation, if we do not get the world to be able to begin to descend the emissions by 2020, we're going to move the world beyond any chance of staying under 1.5 scenario. We will seriously endanger 2 degrees, and once we seriously endanger 2 degrees, then we're really in what the insurance companies call systemically uninsurable. And that is something that, there is no morality in that. There is no responsibility. I cannot imagine that we as adults right now would ever want to be responsible for that kind of action. So immediate mitigation does not mean that we do not do adaptation. We have to do both. We're adults, we can do this. We can walk and chew gum. We can do mitigation and we can do adaptation. And frankly, there's no excuse for not doing both. And if you don't think I'm passionate about that,
I knew this audience would like that answer.
And that's something to complement really what Christiana is saying. I like to tell the environmental community that the pathway toward mitigation has to go through resilience.
Yeah.
In other words, the built environment is a huge energy consumer, just creating it. And if we have to do it over and over and over again, we will use up a lot of resources, we'll use up a lot of energy, we'll create a lot of debris that affects also the environment. So resilience has to be one of the pathways to achieving that, and has to become, kind of a part of this grand strategy.
Absolutely.
And I'm hoping to get that,
No,
incorporated.
and part of the homework that I want to give my team is actually to calculate that when you were calculating emissions from countries like the Caribbean countries, my bet is that the largest portion of the carbon emissions is the reconstruction effort, is the cement and is the rebuilding over and over and over again of all the infrastructure, and therefore it's all connected. We are going to be kicked out of the room at 12:15, so we have 5 minutes for final thoughts. What do you want the audience to walk out of this room remembering in a call for action for greater resilient infrastructure? We'll start with you, Kamal.
Well, from my point of view, as I said earlier, the fact that it needs to be done is very clear. But we are not very clear yet. We have to do a lot of work on how to do it. There are 4 things we need to do. First, good application, good risk metrics of sustainability. Second, really looking at how do we do standards, regulate professions, how much regulation is too much regulation, how much regulation is necessary regulation, how do we work with build capacity, because enforcement without the notion of capacity is meaningless. We have to have capacity to actually enforce. Look at how finance can innovate, nudge people towards resilience, and finally have more predictable systems for recovery. From the Indian side, we are very interested. I highlighted figures of how big infrastructure growth is going to be in India. So we would like to work with countries, have a coalition. We're working with the multilateral development banks and a number of countries in developing that so that we can work together and generate solutions which will build resilience in the years to come.
Kamal, count on us. Haris, final thought. What do you want the audience to walk out of this room in this part of call for action?
I think the reality is we're in a serious problem, and we're in a systemic problem. And part of that problem has to do with some concepts that have been incorporated in the way we decide that are affecting the outcome. For example, this whole concept of affordability. And everyone likes to talk about affordable infrastructure, affordable housing, affordable this, affordable that. But unfortunately, we've kind of distorted that to say we'll achieve affordability by keeping standards low. Okay. And we actually pay a huge social price for that. We need to have
economic price.
Yes.
Both.
We need to make resilience affordable.
Yes.
And we can do that by raising the standards and challenging ourselves through innovation, through going down the cost curves, through changing the incentives to really become affordable at a much higher level than we are today. Because we are building everything below the hazards. We know that. It's not a secret.
Francis, affordable resilience for the next dialogue. We have it there. Christiana, final thoughts.
Well, at the risk of introducing one more issue that we haven't talked about, and that is, where is the financing for all of this going to come from? Because it's not going to be public financing, right? Most of it is going to be private. And just the daunting thought that we have currently after the global financial crisis, we have accumulated about $100 trillion that are sitting under mattresses and pillows and, waiting to be allocated. Only 1.6% of that is into infrastructure. Why? Because most of the banks actually are under a mandate to keep most of their capital, 90% of their capital, with a 30% liquidity requirement. Well, that completely kills out any financing for infrastructure. So that is another systemic issue that we really have to look at. Is that really what we want to do? Or are we actually going to change the mandate to those financial institutions so that they can invest long-term into our infrastructure, which is what many of them want to do, but they're not, through the regulation, they're not being allowed to do that.
Precisely, and for those of you interested in the topic, we have a panel on maximizing finance for development to tackle that precise question.
Good.
And we need to bring resilience to that conversation. With that, please join me in thanking the panel for a wonderful conversation. And apology because we were not able to answer all your questions, and I do encourage to look at the questions that were on Twitter in Resilience Dialogue and maybe inspire you to write a few questions. Thank you very much. We'll see you in the next Resilience Dialogue.
Good job, yeah.
Thank you very much.